posted to Canada. And it really didn't suit her physiology, should we say. With the death of Lord Raglan at Sebastopol and the retirement of Sir James McGrigor, the head of the medical department, Dr. Barry had outlived almost anybody that he would have been able to visit during this last stay in London. Lady Charles Somerset was still at the Piccadilly address, and he was acquainted with Sir Andrew Smith, who was now the Director General, because he and Barry had been medical officers together here at the Cape many years ago. Certain personal matters required attention: a completely new set of uniforms suitable for the cold climate from his military tailor, as well as a call upon Mr. Barry, the respected manager of his agent and banker, Sir Charles McGrigor. Part of this leave was passed at Whitehaven Castle, that's in Cumberland, as the guest of the 2nd Earl of Lonsdale. And while there, Barry received, next slide please, he received this commission, which was his penultimate commission as an officer. It was as a Deputy Inspector of Hospitals with local rank. And there you can see Queen Victoria's signature up there, personally done, and this was from September 1857. To James Barry Esquire, MD, etc. So this is a very typical commission given to an officer. By this time, they were no longer on vellum. You remember the first one I showed you when he got at Plymouth was on vellum. They were now on this sort of paper. So this was the rank equivalent to that of a colonel. Lord Lonsdale, the Earl of Lonsdale, was a friend of Lord Charles Somerset. He was just a couple of years older than Barry, and he was a man passionate about the opera. So passionate indeed that he sired at least 3 daughters on different opera divas. That is true, although he never married. Sorry. So by the time Barry arrived at his new post in November 1857, Canada had been under British administration for nearly a century. And for the purpose of administration, let's have the next slide please, it had been divided into Upper and Lower Canada. Lower Canada, which you see here, was largely French, with Quebec as the capital, and this is Upper Canada, which is largely British, and at the time this map was drawn, 1791, this was still terra incognita. Barry was stationed at Montreal over there. So he arrived at his headquarters in Montreal on the 3rd of November 1857 at the beginning of the winter, and he followed the familiar routine, seeing the commander-in-chief, and as he was the principal medical officer, now he settled into his routine. The average winter temperatures varied between highs of 7 degrees centigrade to lows of minus 15 degrees centigrade, sometimes plummeting even lower. And I can tell you that we have a daughter who lives in Connecticut, and the temperatures there have been minus 14 recently. It gets very, very cold. Now, please permit me just to read a delightful, colourful account of the new arrival in Canada. This was published sometime later. Next slide, please. This is a sleigh, and I'll refer to this in a minute. And the author wrote, "One of the sights in Montreal in the winter was a magnificent red sleigh that dashed along Sherbrooke Street every fine afternoon, silver bells jingling, harness glittering, its coachman and footman in glossy furs on the front seat. But 2 things made the sleigh downright spectacular. Firstly, the lunatic speed at which it was driven, and the grotesque appearance of its solitary passenger. Not quite 5 feet tall, He wore a tight-fitting dark blue military uniform. His chin, half hidden by the folds of his greatcoat collar, was narrow and sloping, his mouth a tiny peevish slit under a beak of a nose. The yellowish cheeks had a kind of withered smoothness, and such of his thinning hair that could be seen under a gold-braided peak cap was dyed scarlet. Every now and again, when the sleigh bounced off or slewed on the icy road, he was flung violently to the floor, cursing in a voice like an angry seagull. Now, isn't that a wonderful description? The writer continued, not quite 5 feet tall, he wore a tight-fitting dark blue military uniform. By this time they'd changed from red to blue uniforms. His chin half hidden by the folds of the greatcoat collar. When Barry submitted his annual report on the 31st of March, 1858, he'd only been in office for about 5 months. There were few surprises, and his interest and concern for all aspects of the welfare and health of the troops was apparent. This now appeared to have become a major concern of his. He drew attention to the climatic extremes facing the men, almost all of whom came from the British Isles and who were unused to the huge seasonal variations in temperature. He found all main barracks were too much crowded, and he recommended that a diminution of at least 3 beds in each room would contribute much to the health and comfort of the occupants. I've looked up the details about space allowed to patients, to soldiers in the barracks, and they vary considerably, but if anyone's interested, I can give them a reference. Of the Quebec barracks, he wrote that there was no oven, therefore no means are afforded of changing the methods of cooking. Rations required variation. He motivated for ovens to be constructed in the cookhouses and to afford the cheering change from eternal boiled beef and soup, as nothing contributes more to general health than a change in diet. Barry was obsessed with healthy diets. Quoting from his extensive experiences, he wrote, "In the West Indies, the Mediterranean, Cape of Good Hope, nay, even St. Helena, salt pork is substituted once a week, and the contractor is bound to supply 1 day each week fresh mutton in lieu of beef, which I must sincerely beg to be recommended as measures that would contribute much not only to the health but the comfort of the soldiers." He then voiced concerns about the fuel used for cooking and winter heating, noting in another letter, "I have invariably found wood as fuel for the use of troops much more healthy than coals." And he was quite correct, but well ahead of the curve for air pollution, as well as the oxides of nitrogen and heavy metals which come out of certain coals. So wood would have been healthy to use in the barracks. The general comfort and well-being of the troops was not confined to the barracks. He firmly advocated the substitution of hair mattresses in place of the straw mattresses currently in use in the hospital beds. They were very much softer to lie on. Then there was the perennial matter of the 3 I's: intoxication, intercourse, and infection. It was the usual story about drunkenness, and by now we all know the short and the long-term consequences of that, so I won't go into that again. An ambivalent attitude to the sexual activities of the troops always prevailed in the army. It was accepted that young men possessed an imperative sexual drive, quite naturally so. Marriages, however, was discouraged on the grounds that having a wife and family would divide the soldier's loyalties, making him less effective in carrying out his military duties. So, although the army would have liked a celibate but committed force of soldiers, it was realized that this was a biological impossibility. and in an attempt to accommodate the sexual needs of the men, prostitution was condoned, often on a large scale. The army compromised as best it could, but now, at this time, it also had to take into account the fact that prevailing Victorian attitudes with regard to perceived immorality were hardening. But it was the barrack accommodation, above all, which exercised the PMO, most particularly in connection with married soldiers. Marriages were permitted among the more senior NCOs, sergeants and so on, who were considered to have shown steadiness and responsibility. And in such cases, the commanding officer would hopefully approve the man's choice of his prospective wife. It was obligatory to obtain the approval of the commanding officer. Once married, the wife would find herself upon the strength, that was, she received some sort of remuneration. And she was then permitted to live with her husband in the camp or the barrack. However, being a wife on the strength was no sinecure. There was a tiny increase in her husband's pay, and in return for this privilege, she would be expected to carry out certain chores, such as laundry, sewing, mending, cleaning, and the like, and living her married life in the corner of a barrack with little or no privacy, amongst a crowd of noisy, coarse, often drunken troops. It must have been particularly testing for any young woman possessing a shred of decency. Dr. Barry was ever sensitive to this and referred to it repeatedly in his reports. However, should a man marry without permission of his commanding officer, no provision whatsoever was made for his wife, and as the soldier's pay was so little, poverty was inevitable, and with poverty went prostitution as virtually the only means of keeping body and soul together. Barry frequently revisited this problem. He wrote, "Probably one of the causes, and a great one, is the absence of separate accommodation for married persons, as however limited. A room for each family would indeed be not only a great boon to the soldiers, but diminish intemperance, less drunkenness, which was the chief cause of crime, punishment, sickness, and death. This I have annually alliterated and re-alliterated," and that is correct. He continued, "For example, a woman humbly born, but modestly and religiously educated, here as the wife of a soldier, is placed in a barrack room with 10 to 20 men. She becomes frightened and disgusted, next becomes habituated, or in despair has recourse to drunkenness. Not infrequently the husband, a good man, joins with his wife in drunkenness. He then becomes the occupant of a cell in the military prison, which, had a similar room been told off for each married person, they might live with decency and bring up their children in the fear of God without having been tainted with the awful and disgusting language and behavior of the barrack room." Now that is total logic. Total logic. You can't argue with that. I mentioned I bought a book by a woman called Mina Trustram about the place of women in the British Army in the Victorian time. If anyone, some of you might like just to glance at that while afterwards. Drunkenness being a given, the other unremitting problem the army faced was persistently high incidence of venereal disease. I hope you'll forgive me for using that term instead of viewing as STD. Venereal disease was what I grew up with, if I can say that. If you can understand what I mean. I could tell you, when we were in fifth year, I think we had to go to VD clinics in Woodstock, and the medical officer in charge there was a Dr. Cohen, and I won't delay you here, but they were quite eye-opening for, I suppose I was probably about my early 20s at that time and had lived in a completely different sort of background, but there we are. So With the army discouraging marriage, sex with prostitutes was an inescapable reality with inescapable consequences, mainly gonorrhea or syphilis or both. Not until the drug Salvarsan came on stream in about 1910, and sulfonamides later, sulfanilamide in the 1930s, was there any possibility of effective treatment for syphilis or gonorrhea. And in respect to the latter, sulfonamides, that only came the sulfonamides only came on stream during my lifetime. So it makes one feel really old. The facts quoted in Barry's report represented a broad cross-section of disease, not only in the army, but also in many other communities at the time. And the results were surprisingly good, considering the elementary diagnostic facilities available at the middle of the 19th century, the limited surgical options, and the absence of effective drugs. There were no antibacterial agents at all, or even disinfectants. Phenol to disinfect wounds or surfaces were only introduced by Lord Lister in the 1860s. That was after Barry's retirement. And don't forget, the very concept of infection as a cause of disease was still completely unknown. Pasteur only advanced his germ theory of disease in 1859, and that was only a theory, the final year of Dr. Barry's career. And even then, it took time for Pasteur's discovery to percolate its way through into clinical practice. So the very idea of infection was entirely new and absolutely revolutionary, unbelievable even. It was on the 7th of December, 1858, that Dr. Barry received his final promotion, this time to Inspector General, and that was the medical equivalent of a brigadier. That was the highest rank to which, for practical purposes, any doctor in the armed forces could aspire. However, the elderly doctor was not long destined to savour the benefits, for of late James had been subject to recurrent and severe chest infections, bronchitis, or more likely bronchopneumonia. Additionally, there were also signs of emotional instability and aggression. The old man was physically and mentally played out. It was later reported, in time she became ill and took to her bed in the house she rented. And since for once she was sick enough to need a doctor, it looked as if her secret would come out at last. She sent for Dr. G.W. Campbell, a civilian who in time became Dean of the Medical Faculty at Montreal's McGill University. Campbell, though he attended her several times and was much her friend, as she ever allowed any man to be, never suspected her real sex. Years later, he would confess to his students, "Gentlemen, if I had not stood in some awe of Inspector General Barry's rank and medical attainments, I would have examined him, that is her, far more thoroughly. Because I did not, and because his, confounded, her bedroom was almost always in total darkness when I paid my calls, this crucial point escaped me, which shows you should never let yourself be too impressed by any colleague to treat him differently from any other patient." Now, when I was at medical school here, one of our teachers was Professor Duplessis in surgery, and he used to say, his favourite example, the phrase, "Even if it is the mayor's wife, you have to examine the patient completely," and he meant completely, top to toe, with everything in between. And I can say in my own career I've discovered a couple of patients with cancer of the rectum and one or two other things which would not have been discovered if one hadn't examined the patient completely. By the spring of 1859, Dr. Barry had had enough. He was old, he was cold, and he was sick. With this serious deterioration in his physical condition, he applied to be relieved of his position temporarily until such time that his health was restored. On the 14th of May 1859, having formally handed over, he sailed, possibly aboard the Allen Line's SS North Britain, which is a fast new ship, whose maiden voyage on the Canada run had been only a few months earlier. The old doctor, now in poor physical shape, reached Liverpool on the 26th of May after a stormy 12-day passage. In the short interval between receiving orders to hand over his command and leaving the country, Dr. Barry had had to pack up, board the vessel. Feeling wretched, debilitated and weakened by his illness, he was able to take along little by way of personal goods and possessions, for what he envisaged was simply going to be a finite period of recovery in Britain, prior to his resuming his duties in Canada. For the time being, all his remaining possessions were left at his residence in Durocher Street. Later, once it had been established that he would no longer be returning to Canada, his goods were packed up on his behalf and dispatched aboard the next convenient ship. Box upon box of papers, letters received, books and diaries. The amount of material accumulated over the decades must have been enormous. Now, what I'm about to tell you has never been revealed before my work. It was a tragedy. The wreck of the John Bull. It was a cruel twist of fate that the vessel upon which the PMO's possessions were loaded at Montreal happened to be the ill-starred steamship John Bull. She was a large vessel, nearly 1,000 tons, which for some time had traded regularly between Canada ports and Glasgow. In late autumn, she set off on her voyage from Montreal, and soon thereafter, could you have the next slide, please? Soon thereafter, she was wrecked upon the Ile d'Orléans at the point there. This is a few miles south of Quebec, in the middle of the St. Lawrence, and the wreck took place at that point. That was a tragedy. I'll just read, there was a report, it was a cruel twist of fate that John will be wrecked, Glasgow, sorry. Unexpectedly, and to my considerable surprise, the original commission, can I see the next one? You've seen this picture before, but this document was on John Bull. The people who went down to the place of the wreck found papers lying all over the place, including this and a Bible with the name James Barry, Dr. James Barry in it. And this one I've shown you before. It was the one signed by the Prince Regent on behalf of George III, and this was the first commission that James Barry received when he was still at the hospital in Plymouth. Now, I've found a description of this from a local newspaper. It reads, about 7 or 8 years ago, so a large outward-bound vessel, the John Bull, was wrecked late in the autumn at the lower end of the island of Orléans. On board this ship was a quantity of books and other effects shipped at Montreal, nearly all of which was scattered about the beach. We are credibly informed that it was discovered the other day that among the effects recovered from among the fragments of the wreck was a Bible bearing the name Dr. James Barry and a parchment commission as assistant surgeon issued to the same individual. Both these articles are in the possession of a young professional gentleman in this city, that was Quebec. The wreck of John Bull was a sad fate, not only for the passengers and crew, but also for the owners of the goods. so many personal documents which could have been of inestimable value in describing and understanding Dr. Barry's life more completely, were thereby denied to biographers and historians. Diaries, personal letters and souvenirs, and perhaps even drafts which might have provided valuable insight into the innermost thoughts and attitudes and perhaps fears of this highly complex individual. They were just lost forever, strewn on a beach in the middle of the St. Lawrence River and eventually blown by the winds and washed away by the tide. Let's have the next slide, please. The Atlantic crossing was rough and unpleasant. This is, you can see this is an early steamer of the time. Notice she's a paddle steamer. She has two engines, so one was for one wheel and one for the other, but she's still rigged as a sailing ship, completely rigged as a bark for just in case her engines failed, because this was quite early and it's a long way to get across the Atlantic if your engines aren't working properly. So that is quite a, there's this tremendous following wind here, fortunately, and you can see the smoke from the stacks blowing forward and her sails are filled, they're squared, and so she's going in this big sea towards Liverpool. So it was a rough and tempestuous voyage, an unpleasant one. Although, despite the foul weather, the passage took 12 days from Quebec. It was pretty good at the time. Dr. Barry later stated that he'd laboured under the effects of seasickness during a rough and tempestuous voyage, but the relative comfort of a good cabin and the personal attention of his servant, heaven knows how he felt, might have alleviated his suffering to a little. But given the circumstances of this passage, as well as his pre-existing bronchopneumonia, it is hardly surprising that it was a dreadful experience. So awful did he feel following disembarkation at Liverpool that he spent a few days recuperating before he and John made their trip to London in the comfort of a railway carriage. This was an innovation at the time. And so they finally reached the capital on the 1st of June, a scant 3 days before the Inspector General was ordered to present himself before a medical board. Let's have a look at the next slide. This is a very important document of Dr. Barry. I've seen the rough draft of this, but this document is, you note the very evenness of the script there. It is done by a professional scrivener. And early people who were trying to identify James Barry by comparing early script with this didn't realize that this wasn't in Dr. Barry's handwriting at all. It was a professional writer. So those conclusions, people said there was a similarity between his script and this, that is not valid. So this, in the extracts of this read, they're about 5 or 6 pages. Extracts read, immediately on my arrival in London, scarcely recovered, and in addition labouring under the effects of seasickness during a rough and tempestuous voyage, I was ordered before a medical board. Of the proceedings of this board, which consisted then of 3 junior doctors, he wrote, perfect strangers to me and my peculiar habits. I know nothing, but the result was my being placed upon half pay without having completed my period of service in the rank I had attained, which I deemed hard, considering my faithful and active service extending over a period of more than 40 years. Concluding his memorandum with a pathetic plea, he wrote, "Your memorialist therefore prays that he may be restored to full pay and ordered back to Canada until he has completed his full period of service, of which he requires nearly 20 months. which means your memorialist will be saved from great pecuniary loss, and for the grant of which request your memorialist ever shall pray. James confidently entertained the expectation of returning to Canada to complete the remaining time of the Inspector General, which would qualify him for half pay, calculated that on that salary. The difference between a colonel's and an Inspector General's pay was about 30%. The Inspector General got 30 shillings a day, the Deputy Inspector General 24 shillings a day. Multiply that by 100 and you get the rough figure for today compared by today's value for money. Significantly, it appears that none of the 3 doctors on the board had physically examined the patient. What sort of doctor is that? Look, Barry's main problem was his chest. And by that time, the stethoscope wasn't just a single tube, they were binaural stethoscopes. Had even one of those 3 doctors done their duty thoroughly, he would have been spotted that the old doctor was a woman. This careless omission was probably most fortunate, for otherwise James might well have been discharged without any pay at all. Close shave. Following his impassioned plea, Dr. Barry received deafening silence. His career was over. There was no return to his post in Canada, no financial reward arising from the new rank, no amelioration of his financial situation, no royal honour. Let's have the next slide, please. Rootless now, without family or even a family home, and in a precarious financial position, life in retirement became uncertain and difficult for the old doctor. He continued to retain his manservant and to keep Psyche, the latest incarnation of his little white dog, but by now there were even fewer friends left in London. He had no remaining contacts at Horse Guards and hardly saw any of his colleagues of yore, except Dr. McKinnon, who looked after him. Lady Charles Somerset, his dear friend, he still visited occasionally during this, the final year of her life. She was to die aged 72 on the 11th of June 1860. And with her died his last remaining link to much that he'd cherished and held dear. Lady Raglan was to outlive Barry by 16 years. Ruskin's description of London in the 1860s conjured up a picture entirely unsuited to an elderly individual with a bad chest. Ruskin said, "This great foul city of London, rattling, growing, smoking, stinking, ghastly heap of fermenting brickwork, pouring out poison at every pore." And London was indeed like that. This enforced retirement presented particular challenges to Dr. Barry. However, he eventually felt strong enough to travel, and, accompanied by John and his dog, he decided to revisit some of his old haunts for the last time. Perhaps it was hearing of the recent death of Sir Willoughby Cotton, which had made James pine for the past, with thoughts about Jamaica. He sailed directly to Kingston, as he had done 30 years before, aboard the Old Guardian. Accommodation was available at Up Park or Stony Hill free of charge. An important factor, as Barry's visit was to be of some duration, and he was short of cash. Being someone who was always much more comfortable in a tropical climate, the underlying reason might simply have been to revisit the haunts of his younger days and feel again the benefit of the warm sun of the tropics on his old bones. Nostalgia, pure and simple. Let's have the next picture. This single tangible relic of this final visit abroad is the photograph showing Dr. Barry with his manservant and his dog. This particular image is a paper print. It is not a daguerreotype, as has been alleged. And clearly stamped on the back. Let's see the back, please. Sorry, it's not quite so clear. Oh yes, it's by Duperley Brothers in Kingston, with the photographers. Let's go back to the picture. Thank you. It is not a it is the greatest significance that Dr. Barry's manservant has been included in this double portrait. It emphasizes the importance of this man in the life of his employer. Since the early 1830s in Jamaica, he had been the single constant figure in Barry's life. And it is probable that he was by now the old man's sole friend, companion, and perhaps confidant. By chance, in December 1949, a letter from a Mr. McCrindle to the editor of the Glasgow Herald came to light and revealed some details about this period of Barry's life, about his visit. McCrindle wrote, "Readers may be interested to know that Dr. Barry was well known to my parents when they lived in Kingston, and I have often heard my mother speak of him. They never at any time suspected his sex. My father was a chemist and druggist in Kingston, and the doctor dealt with him frequently. But he only ate vegetables and fruit. When he wanted a haircut, he drove to their house and went and sent for the barber to get his hair cut and dressed. Of course, all the floors were polished, so it was not difficult to get rid of the hair. He made presents of jewellery. One piece he gave to my father was a signet ring with a crest on it. To my mother, he gave a memoriam ring with "Sacred to the Memory of Marion." Now, I mentioned earlier, before the two went to Edinburgh, his mother became very ill, and she made her will, and among the will she ordered 4 memorial rings. And I think that this was one of those memorial rings that this chap was talking about. Marianne can certainly be mistaken for Mary Ann. All right. Let's go there. Thank you. While in the West Indies, Barry enjoyed, next slide please, he enjoyed a reunion with, can you guess who this might be? This is his erstwhile dueling antagonist. He is now General Cloutey, who was the Governor General in Barbados. So he had a final reunion with Josias Cloutey, his friend and former dueling antagonist from those days long gone in the Cape. By then, General Josias Cloutey was an officer commanding the Windward and Leeward Command stationed at Bridgetown, Barbados, 300-odd nautical miles east of Kingston, and the old doctor made the easy 2-day passage there from Jamaica on the inter-island steamer. In London, Barry's life was now drawing to a close. There, apart from occasional excursions, he lived out the remainder of his days. Historically, his retirement years, 1860 to 65, were by no means without other incidents. And there were frequent references to the American Civil War, which was taking place at the time, 1861-65, which dragged on until the May. In London in 1860, the first horse-drawn tram service made its appearance in Westminster. And the next year, the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, plunged Queen Victoria into inconsolable grief. Incidentally, recent research suggests that he died not of typhoid, as always believed, but possibly of Crohn's disease, which is a different sort of thing entirely. And that same year, far away in Russia, Tsar Alexander II finally abolished serfdom. The old doctor seemed everywhere surrounded by stirrings of a perplexing new world. And I must say, I must admit sometimes that I feel a bit like that myself these days. Maybe some of you do as well. All right, next slide, please. The final days. This is an extract from Dido's Lament from the Aeneid. You remember Aeneas spent some time with Dido in what is today Tunisia, and he had to go off because he had destiny to complete, and Dido said, "Death is now a welcome guest. When I am laid in earth, remember me." It was at 14 Margaret Street, Cavendish Square, that on the 25th of July 1865, James Barry died. 39 years to the day after his historic caesarean section, which was done in Wynberg. He'd lived in Margaret Street in retirement, situated in a part of London with which he was familiar, having, as a girl, 50 years earlier, lodged at a number of addresses in the vicinity. It was ideal for his purpose, close to Cavendish Square, Portland Place and Regent Street, that area of London which was still, get this, still reasonably affordable. The original building, though, no longer stands. Reaching the stage where he needed medical attention, he was attended by Staff Surgeon Major McKinnon, known to him for many years and based nearby. McKinnon made regular visits to his elderly patient, but unfortunately, as spring became summer, there came not relief but more trouble. Trouble arising from the concatenation of conditions which were to end the life of the old doctor: the weather, the water, and waste, human waste. Since the Great Stink of 1858, you heard about the Great Stink? It was the Thames flowed more and more slowly because of dry weather, and sewage was simply poured. The Thames was simply a sewer, and the smell in the Houses of Parliament was such. This is a brand new House of Parliament. The smell was so bad that they couldn't continue to carry out work there. So the whole of Parliament went off to Hampton Court up the river and to be able to do their business. And this great stink actually concentrated the minds of the members of Parliament about what to do about it. There had to be a solution. And Parliament had dithered about the cost of Joseph Bazalgette's proposed radical solution to the disposal of Rwanda's sewers. And with further epidemics of cholera inevitable, the MPs at long last were obliged to concentrate their collective mind, and eventually the construction of the system of sewers, which still serve London today, was approached to completion. Did Dr. Barry die of cholera? The condition for which Dr. McKinnon had been treating James Barry, he labelled simply as diarrhea. It is more than likely that Barry's diarrhea was due to cholera. Most of the cases of diarrhea in 1865, and there were many, were caused by cholera, but not necessarily recognised or called that, because within the medical profession there was always a reluctance to use the word cholera, because you just mentioned the word and there was fear, alarm and despondency amongst people, because cholera was so fatal that people sort of went to pieces and would probably leave the place and cause a great deal of upset. So the mere mention of the word was capable of inducing panic and dread. The next year, though, there was no doubt. In 1866, London alone had 5,600 deaths, which is quite a lot. And they were due to cholera. Barry's final hours, for a fastidious 76-year-old, the last hours on earth were desperately uncomfortable. Passing frequent watery stools, smelling of fish and looking like rice water, unable to summon the energy to get out of bed and too weak even to be helped onto a bedside commode, he lay in his soiled, sodden, stinking sheets. He was hot, dry and thirsty, and everything was made worse by the insufferable heat outside. That day had been just one of a succession where the temperatures had ranged from the high 20s to figures in excess of 32 degrees centigrade. Please note, this was before global warming had been invented. Dehydration resulted in a drop of blood pressure, difficulty in breathing and swallowing followed, unable to cough up his sticky, tenacious sputum. He finally lapsed into coma, and death, when it eventually came at 4 o'clock in the morning, 1 hour before dawn on Tuesday the 25th of July, death was a mercy. A woman who was a layer out, this is before undertakers had really got going as a profession. A woman who was a layer out, the layer outs were often midwives as well, unofficial midwife. She was called and set about her business. She cut the soiled nightshirt and saw that the breasts, though flat, small and flaccid, could have passed for those of an old woman. Although she recalled having seen something similar in the body of an old man before. Continuing downwards, she was startled to see that this was not the body of an old man. It was the body of an old woman. She closely inspected every detail, now laid bare before her eyes. There was no doubt at all. In every detail, the mortal remains lying before her were those of a woman. She began to the task of washing and again examining carefully, and saw a further discovery in the skin of the lower abdomen that there were curved silvery marks, telltale signs unmistakable for anything other than the stretch marks of a past pregnancy. She had made a truly extraordinary discovery. The late Inspector General, Dr. James Barry, had been a woman what's more, who at some time long ago had given birth. She began her task washing again and examining carefully. On that hot, still Tuesday morning, the sun was up by 5:15 to reveal another almost cloudless day. The night soil men had finished their messy business in Margaret Street and were already on their way with their night's load in their cart. Mrs. Anderson, she was the wife of the owner of the house, wanted the body out of her house as soon as possible. So John, somberly dressed and loyal to the end, made his way to Dr. McKinnon's office with the melancholy news. McKinnon was not surprised and penned a note confirming the death and stating it as cause diarrhea, carefully avoiding the word cholera. Pocketing the certificate for later delivery to the Registrar of Births and Deaths in Marylebone. Let's have the next slide, please. This is the death certificate. This is not the original. This is a copy. I wanted to get a copy of I wanted to get the original, but they were now kept in Liverpool, and the cost of getting a copy of the original, a photocopy of the original, was far outweighed the benefit. It wouldn't be a cost benefit. But here you are, 25th at 14 Margaret Street, James Barry, male, about 70 years, and then Inspector General of Military Hospitals, diarrhea, confirmed the diagnosis, and then it goes on. So that's a pretty standard death certificate. So John, the servant, went to Barry's agents. The manager's name was Mr. Barry. It's just B-A-R-R-I-E, spelled differently. And he was sympathetic but unsurprised, because Barry had been with his firm for many, many years, and he knew better than anyone the circumstances of the late doctor, and realized that only his firm, the firm of McGregor's, would be able to attend to the formalities and put funeral arrangements in hand. Barry had been their client for decades, and over many years his salary, then his half pay, had been deposited directly into his account there. It seems likely that one of Mr. Barry's staff called at the Margaret Street house to gather the remaining effects, including, amongst others, a travelling trunk. And they may have been delivered to his office with the help of the servant, and it is well within the bounds of possibility that at this point John was given money by Mr. Barry for his return to Jamaica. Conspicuous by their absence were any death notices in the leading newspapers of the day. And I spent the greater part of a day in the archives, the newspaper archives of the British Library, going through the death notices. And it's quite correct, there were no death notices. 2 days later, on Thursday, the 27th of July, permission was granted from the office of the General Cemetery Company at Kensal Green for the purchase of plot number 19301 for the sum of 3 guineas, the grave to be dug 6 foot 6 long, 2 foot 6 wide and 7 feet deep, to accommodate a coffin 6 foot 6 long by 2 foot 2 wide, and the name of the individual who purchased the plot is not recorded, only the price. The large dimensions reflect the demand for coffins in London at that time. Kensal Green Cemetery, with Margaret Bulkley finally laid to rest on the 29th of July. Can we have the next slide, please? After her exceptional, unconventional and controversial career, there was erected at Kensal Green a simple headstone with only the barest details. And the details were not correct. She died on the 25th of July, aged 74 years, and so these details on here are not actually correct with me. I'm looking at them. This photograph was taken a long time ago, so perhaps I've still got a bit of hair left. So some 2 weeks, now things start getting very interesting. 2 weeks after the funeral, a whisper of the story of the layer out had escaped or been sold, next slide please, to this Irish newspaper, Saunders Newsletter and Daily Advertiser. It was Monday the 14th of August 1868. And down, I can't put the whole thing on, but down in this corner there was a very reasonable account of Dr. Barry's life. There were inaccuracies but how they got all those details is amazing. This inconspicuous article revealed to an incredulous public the startling news about the sex of the late Dr. Barry. The army was shocked. The piece, which appeared without any particular heading or byline, was surprisingly accurate, and it was subsequently reprinted in a number of local and national papers. The Registrar of Births and Deaths, George Graham, had seen a copy on the 23rd of August, and Dr. McKinnon received a letter written in the politest possible terms from Graham, seeking clarification. He wrote, "I ask not for publication, but for my own information." McKinnon responded, now this is interesting, "On one occasion, after Dr. Barry's death, I was sent for to the office of Sir Charles McGrigor, that was Barry's agent, and there the woman who performed the last offices for Dr. Barry was waiting to speak to me. She wanted to obtain some sort of perquisite for her employment, which the lady who kept the lodging house in which Dr. Barry died had refused to give her. I don't know if there are any Scots people here, but there were a Scottish couple who owned the house. Among other things, she said Dr. Barry was female, and that I was a pretty doctor not to know this, and that she wouldn't like to be attended by me. I informed her that it was none of my business whether Dr. Barry was a male or a female, and that I thought it as likely that it might be neither. namely an imperfectly developed man. She then said she had examined the body and that it was a perfect female, and further there were marks on her skin, having had a child when very young. I then inquired, how have you formed this opinion? The woman, pointing to the lower part of her own stomach, said, from marks here. I'm a married woman and the mother of 9 children, and I ought to know. So at some time towards the end of her long life lived as a man, the aging Margaret Bulkley. This is really rather sad. The aging Margaret Bulkley had felt the need to paste into the lid of her travelling trunk prints of beautiful gowns, shawls and parasols. It remains ineffably saddening to think about those fashion plates. More than most, she was aware that life cannot last forever, and maybe this was her way of leaving a message, her testament from beyond the grave. I was truly a woman, and it's as a woman I wish to be remembered. Few are the army doctors who are remembered by posterity. Sir Ronald Ross, who did seminal work on malaria, Walter Reed on yellow fever, and earlier James Lind for scurvy, are the only names I can recall. Improvement in the lot of the common soldier, as well as the poor of the slaves and people living in the margins of society, poverty in the Cape, were attributable to Dr. Barry. And the exceptional achievements of Margaret Bulkley and her unique story deserve to be acknowledged and more widely known. Her place is perfectly justified in the company of Mary Wollstonecraft, Elizabeth Fry, and Florence Nightingale. The last, next slide please. This is the last slide. This is the certificate of the medical qualification of Elizabeth Garrett, who was the next woman to qualify in England after Dr. Barry. This was shortly after Dr. Barry died in 1865, I think it was. 25th of September 1865. I've been asked, do you think Dr. Barry had any influence on this qualification? I don't think so at all. Elizabeth Garrett went her own way, and there was no time, their paths didn't cross at any stage. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention over the past several days. And I would also like to thank Angus and Matthew here, who've been in attendance all the time, looking after the audio-visual stuff and the microphone. And I appreciate the summer school for giving me the opportunity of presenting this extraordinary story to you. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thank you. Thank you.
Michael,
yes.
I've known you for many years.
That's Sean up there. I recognise the voice.
Example of what a medical man should be. In your retirement, you have gone to great lengths across the world to give us this information. And what you've unfolded is truly a most remarkable story. It's quite outstanding what you have done, and we and I appreciate enormously your efforts to bring it to our attention. Your book is quite outstanding, and I recommend that everyone here and their friends and their family, and when they want to buy presents, they buy this book, because it upholds the belief that women have a real place in the medical world. Thank you, Michael.
That was my old friend, Professor Sean Sellers. Thank you, Sean.